On October 29, 1984, the Drummondville Volunteers won their game, bringing their win streak up to 8, with only a tie against Verdun breaking it up. This was far from a fluke win or squeaking out at the last minute either. Nope, it was a complete and utter domination of the other team, tarring and feathering them for a score of 9-3. It was a really good game for a team that would go on to end their regular season with a 42-win record. They would only lose out to an equal 42-win Chickatumi team and a Shawinigan team that was able to claim 49 wins, winning the John Ragu Trophy in 1985 for having the most points in the regular season. Needless to say, this win would surely help materialize a greater run. On October 31st, 1984, Drummondville was losing 7-1, getting clobbered in Laval. That 8-game win streak they enjoyed might as well have been a children's bedtime story by the end of the second period. At the end of the day, they lost 7-1, and they were sent back to their locker rooms to brood over the loss. However, as they went back to their locker rooms, news from the grapevine came. Remember that 8-game win streak that Drummondville enjoyed up till that night? Well, according to the QMJHL, that win streak was only slated as 7 wins. In fact, those wins that Drummondville got that I told you about just a while ago, those were lies. Drummondville only sat at 41 wins at the end of the year. So did Chickatumi. Shawinigan could only claim 48. The reason for this is simple. The game on October 29th was stricken from the record book. 17 games, in fact, were ripped out of history like a band-aid. For onlookers in the modern day, it was as though nothing had happened at all. What happened? Why did this happen? To answer that question, we gotta look back on the existence of one of the most dumb, unfortunate, and downtrodden teams to have ever graced this sport. They disappeared as soon as they came, leaving behind only breadcrumbs for unknowledgeable to pick up. They were like a gust of wind blowing through the New York air, entirely gone and entirely forgotten. Well, almost forgotten. To understand the story of the Plattsburgh Pioneers and how insane it was, it's important to know the context that lays the groundwork for this disaster. It would be best to start with noting that the Quebec Major Junior Hockey League, often abbreviated to the QMJHL, was very French. Though the league has dipped its toes into different provinces such as New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, and Prince Edward Island, their main hub has still remained Quebec to this day. Most of the stars that you saw come out of the league at the time were of French-Canadian descent. Mario Lemieux of Laval and Patrick Waugh of Granby, two transcendent stars coming out of the juniors at the time, were both born within the borders of the Fleur-de-Lis. It doesn't just stop at the superstars either. According to the data gathered at Quote Hockey, a site that stores information about past rosters, scores, and records from a variety of leagues, 89% of the players that played in the 1984-85 QMJHL season were born in Quebec. On top of this, most teams were located within 1 to 5 hours of Montreal itself, thus allowing for quick travel between games, with a few teams essentially planted in Montreal. So, as stated previously, the QMJHL was pretty French. Plattsburgh, New York, on the other hand, was not quite so. Located an hour away from Montreal, Plattsburgh served a community of about 21,000 according to a 1980 census. Plattsburgh itself isn't as commercially known as its big brother in the West in Buffalo for its raw hockey talent, or really for anything for that matter. I guarantee you this is the first time you've ever heard of Plattsburgh, New York, and if you disagree, you're lying, because I'm always right. Plattsburgh just mostly serves the State University of New York, amassing a decently sized student population. In 2020, about 24% of Plattsburgh residents were attending the university. Assuming that I haven't scared off the majority of viewers by regaling them with more information about Plattsburgh, New York than they could justifiably need, the point is, Plattsburgh is a relatively obscure town, but it does have a decent hockey culture. It was so much so that it convinced future owner of the Pioneers, Dennis thought, that the Q might be able to work here. Up to that point, only the WHL was brave enough to dip its toes into the American market, establishing teams in Seattle and Portland. But the OHL, a main rival of the QMJHL, had no teams in the eastern United States. Now, it's important to note that the OHL and the QMJHL had a fierce rivalry with one another as they were part of the CHL, a connection of leagues that helped build up the juniors for NHL play. The QMJHL had lost the Memorial Cup in 1982 after Sherbrooke failed to beat Kitchener and hadn't won it since. Now, it would be a real shame if the QMJHL would be able to snag a few good players from the States to help bolster their rosters, now wouldn't it? Plus, if the league felt so inclined, they'd be able to set up new TV revenue markets to compete with the WHL and the OHL to reclaim the Memorial Cup. Now, it wasn't a priority, but it was a nice to have, if I must be honest, for the league. And it was a done deal in their eyes. In an act of both ambition for a flourishing hockey market in New England and a desire to be the first to reap the spoils of an untapped market, QMJHL accepted the bid from Dennis Mathot, and Plattsburgh successfully got themselves a hockey team. Expansion of the QMJHL at the time wasn't unprecedented. In 1982, the league expanded to 2 new teams, a move that was last done during the 1970s. These 2 teams were the Lungale Chevaliers and our old friends in the Drummondville Volunteers. Drummondville stumbled out of the gate, as an expansion franchise usually does. But soon got their footing around the time Plattsburgh joined. Lungale, on the other hand, had the immediate success that teams dream of, going to the finals in their first season of play, but falling in the finals. However, as those teams' 2 stories were vastly different from one another, they shared a common similarity that Plattsburgh can never have. They were situated in Quebec. See, the QMJHL prided itself on their French-Canadian heritage, so much so that they might have had an active disdain for the Pioneers' existence. They were outsiders, after all, strangers leaving mud on the floor and trash on a table, wishing to stay for the night at their place, an enigma in the eyes of the Quebec leadership. There was a reason why the QMJHL solely remained in Quebec until they were dragged kicking and screaming into the other provinces. Outside of the Montreal Canadiens and Quebec Nordiques, there were truly no French-Canadian areas in North America to house French-Canadian talent. It would be like if the northern states of the US just up and left from participating in the NHL and other leagues because they didn't want their talent to be drowned out by Canadians and New Englanders. Of course, this is heavily simplifying things down for the sake of an example, but back in 1984, this was most likely how the QMJHL felt. Why do I say this?
Dans un référendum, comme nous l'avons promis. J'avais pensé que je pouvais être aussi fier d'être québécois que ce soir.
In 1980, Quebec attempted to hold a vote to become its own independent nation away from Canada. This referendum was a drop-in-the-pan vote either. This vote was decades in the making by Quebec politicians, organizations, and the overall culture of the area. As noted by Reg Whitaker in the book Is Quebec Nationalism Just?, a collection of essays and theories by various writers about the relationship between Quebec and Canada, the Francophone culture was alive and well from the 40s and 50s, but was steadily declining. Quebec was a part of the French Empire up until the 7 Years' War, when the land was ceded over to the British along with the rest of France's North American territories. Ever since that moment, the French culture that Quebec adorned started to slowly fade away like a dying ember. Factors such as the increasing number of Anglo-Canadians in Quebec cities like Montreal, as well as a more unified Canadian identity growing, caused the influence of the French ancestry of many to dwindle. Many young people in Quebec refer to the identity of their francophone roots as a great struggle, as concluded by a survey during the late 90s. As a result of this mounting apathy towards the French-Canadian identity, many groups formed in the 60s to promote Quebec's sovereignty and culture. In 1976, under the leadership of René Lévesque, the Parti Québécois managed to dethrone the Liberals in charge of Quebec, thus granting them the power to seek independence. René knew that immediately attempting independence would be a foolish game, however, and waited until 1979, when Trudeau, not that one, the other one, lost in the Canadian general election. In 1980, René gave his hand to independence, launching a referendum that would gauge the interest in Quebec about the autonomy of the region. This referendum wasn't for the independence of Quebec, but would allow for a discussion of independence to be debated and agreed upon in the government. However, at that moment, the one that the Parti Québécois was dreaming of for over a decade was blown away like sand when the results came in. Of the 86% of Quebec citizens that voted on the referendum, 60% said no. Though the talks of independence still lingered on in the air during the year of our Lord, 1981, Quebec independence was, essentially, dead in the water. It was only when, in 1984, Brian Mulroney was elected in the Canadian general election that the talk of independence really started up again. At this time, the QMJHL might have been looking to preserve the talent from their native province for the French-Canadian teams. This isn't as common as you might think. States and provinces from across the world pay big dollars to keep homegrown talent within their borders, or to bring them back within the fold. This can include the Maple Leafs giving out $77 million to John Tavares to play in his hometown of Toronto, or the matching Parise and Suter deals that brought the two back to Minnesota. These deals, though not as common as the normal ones, do occasionally occur, and the same applied to the QMJHL. However, this was a far different matter. Rather than actually giving the Pioneers a fighting chance in the league against guys like Luc Robitaille, Claude Lemieux, and Jimmy Carson, the QMJHL left them dead to rights. They would not hold the Pioneers an expansion draft. An expansion draft, for those of you who don't know, is a draft held by a league for a new team. Typically, the new team is allowed to pick one player from each team to help fill the roster for opening night, as well as aid for the construction of their future. The most recent example of this system being utilized in major North American sports were the Seattle Kraken this year, situated nearly 3,000 miles from where the Pioneers played. There, they selected the bulk of what their modern team is today. Now that's not to say each team is forced to give up their best player. Each team is allowed to protect a certain number of players of their roster by rule. In NHL today, that means either 8 skaters and 1 goalie is protected, or 7 forwards, 3 defensemen, and 1 goalie is protected. There's another thing about expansion teams that is crucial to mention. Most of the time, they suck. The Golden Knights appear to be the exception to this rule, but a majority of the time, a new team in the league flounders, epitomized by the 1974-75 Capitals, who won only 8 games in their inaugural season. To further drive home the point, the NHL expanded to 7 new markets during the 1990s. Some of these new teams would later become 2 straight Stanley Cup champions. Others would become bedrocks for hockey in the South, a market that not many people thought it would work in, and the Atlanta Thrashers. But in their inaugural seasons, all 7 of these teams combined for 158 wins. That's not entirely terrible on the surface, but if you take into account their total record, you reveal the depressing fact that they only won 27% of their games combined in their inaugural seasons. Not terribly great. So, expansion teams were usually universally bad. The Pioneers, however, would be a whole world of hell. By not allowing Plattsburgh to dip their toes into the players already playing in the league, they had to scramble to create a team. What's worse was a clause in the agreement of the Pioneers joining the QMJHL stating that they were required to play only American players. The gates that held the world's best players in sight of Plattsburgh from their office were slammed shut right in front of them. This is what caved the Pioneers in. Though there was a slew of troubles in the future that eventually led to their demise, this was the moment that sealed their fate, whether the team liked it or not. By not allowing players from Canada, specifically Quebec, to join the team, and with American talent already signed in either the OHL or playing for the NCAA, the team had to search for scraps. Joining the team was also a hurdle that many had to achieve. One of these players was John Torchetti, who would later go on to bounce around from team to team in a managerial role, eventually winning a cup with Chicago. When recounting the decision to join the Pioneers, Torchetti reflected, saying that it was Plattsburgh or go to West Point and become a pilot. I gave up my college playing eligibility to go there. Torchetti wasn't alone in this exodus to Plattsburgh either. Scott Rutu, one of the Pioneers' best statistical players, made the trek over from Junior B to join the team after being drafted. Numerous others sacrificed years of academics and playing the NCAA for Plattsburgh. For most of the team, it was their first experience on a team outside of their home. Some even experienced life without their parents for the first time, as Torchetti commented on. Reading through all of the accounts of the players, where they came from individually, and just how young they were in general, one would be remiss not to feel a pang of sympathy for the poor souls that made the pilgrimage to Plattsburgh. They had so much to lose, with only an operation held together by tape and glue to hold them up. These were boys, no older than 20, venturing into the unknown for search of greatness and glory, exploring the unfamiliar territory, and growing accustomed to the environment around it. I, and maybe they, believe they had visions of the President's Cup in their hands. While the image of a pioneer is often romanticized, we often ignore the trials and risks that arise whenever pioneers emerge. Because if they're not careful, the field they're trying to conquer will conquer them, swallowing them into a grave of dirt and ash. Opening night was September 15th, 1984. The Pioneers would be playing their first home game at the Ronald B. Stafford Ice Arena, hosting around 1,500 fans from estimates at the time. While it wasn't their first game overall, seeing as they played preseason games, even winning one of them, this was their first home game with points on the table. Their first opponent would be the Hull Olympics, hiking down 150 miles from their home base to Plattsburgh for the game. The coach of this ragtag group of players was actually more difficult to find than I initially realized. When I searched up the name of the coach of the Pioneers, a man by the name of Yves Bedreau kept coming up. Yves Bedreau was a man for whom I could find no information about. On the August 30th issue of the Press Republican, a newspaper that serves primarily the Plattsburgh, New York area, they list Dennis Mathot as the owner-coach of the Pioneers. Where and who this Yves Bedreau is, I haven't gotten a single clue. My best guess is that he was a character created by someone retelling the story of the Pioneers as a way to make it more interesting than it already was. A ghost that was created after mass hallucinations from the entire hockey world. While I'd love to show you how the game went, the individual goals, and any interesting plays that may have occurred, a trend that emerges when looking for Pioneers gameplay is a distinct lack of any. Only a single video of the Pioneers survives into the modern day, thanks in parts to the effort of YouTube user Arktoshore. The link will be in the description. Even then, we're left a bit in the dark. Due to the obscure nature of the records and stats that the Pioneers put up in the 1984 season, most of the games are left without context. We're left to merely speculate who and what killed this team in and out each night, like the fate of a person who went missing and was never seen again. In a way, that described the Pioneers. Thankfully, however, I was able to uncover the accounts of the first game, against Hull. The first period of the game against Hull was rather rough. A minute 25 into the affair sees Hull forward Joe Faglietta rip one past who I assume to be Joel Kears in net. Things don't improve as the first drags on, as just 3 minutes after Faglietta's goal, Hull's Mario Alouette scores past Plattsburgh to make it a 2-0 affair. To twist the knife deeper into the wound, Steven Ricker manages to get one past Kears late in the first to make it a 3-0 game. The hockey gods must have taken pity upon the Pioneers in their blight, as almost 5 minutes into the second period, Dino Volpiti scored, giving the Pioneers not only their first goal of the game, but their first goal as a franchise. 1,460 people roared as Dino and the rest of the Pioneers celebrated. Though they had not found the Mississippi River, or a passage to the northwest, they had broken new ground, becoming the first U.S. team to score a goal in the QMJHL. The celebrations didn't last long, however, as Mario Alouette of the Olympics made his presence known once again, scoring past Plattsburgh to make his second of the night, returning the lead to 3. Nothing of note occurs for the next 8 minutes according to the books. Yet, what wasn't told were the foundations of the thing that the Pioneers are most well known for, aside from their main tale of misery. With 3 minutes and 47 seconds left in the second period, all hell broke loose inside Ronald B. Stafford Arena. Due to a lack of video, as we've established finding Pioneers footage is as rare as finding Bigfoot, only so much of the fight can be broken down and explained. However, it does tell us a lot about who these Pioneers were, and how they handled adversity. Volpetta in 90 can be seen here holding down a small scrum of players from both Hull and Plattsburgh before not getting one, but 2 Hull players going after him, with only a teammate acting as a wall for him. Todd Smith of Hull is huffing and puffing, hoping to grab Volpetta in for a scrum. As all of this is going on, Jake Salzburg can be seen casually skating away, as if he just encountered a fight between 2 customers in a Walmart and decided it was time to go back to bed. He eventually ends up in a hug with Sam Lang of Hull. In the next shot, we see Luke Robitaille of all people, having to rip his teammate away from the boards to not get any more penalties for Hull, as if it mattered at all at that point. That doesn't stop Hull players from conversing in idle chit-chat with the crowd. I can only assume that these nice discussions were over the literary merits of Hemingway, whose books were still fresh in the minds of the reading public across the United States. A few more scrums break out as the referee merely writes in his notebook the penalties he knows of, like a disappointed teacher writing up a kid for drawing inappropriate images on the chalkboard. Suddenly, a Hull player I couldn't identify from the film unleashed a nasty sucker punch on a Plattsburgh player, catching them right in the face and bringing them to the ground. Had this not happened, I don't doubt that the game might not have gone in Plattsburgh's favor. They were carrying momentum from the fight and still had a few of their best players in the lineup. Instigating that fight more caused Plattsburgh to lose more of their players, including Volpetta. As Dino skates away, he throws his hands up, almost like a kid going, "Bet you couldn't do that!" He's gotta be my favorite player on this team. In total, 6 players got the boot for the rest of the game for misconducts, with 84 total minutes and penalties. Luke Robitaille, a future Hall of Famer for the Los Angeles Kings, was among these 6. It didn't really add to the story of Plattsburgh at all, but I just found it funny. With 3 of their best players out of the game, one might not have been out of place in thinking that the Pioneers were screwed. Even after a Luis Finocchiaro goal to start the third, lowering Hull's lead back down to 2, 2 more goals by Hull created a near back-breaking 4-goal deficit for Plattsburgh to come back from. But then, with the crowd at their backs and the winds of change suddenly blowing in their favor, Edward Constantine fires one past Hull goaltender to bring their lead back down to 3. 6 minutes later, Luis Finocchiaro strikes again, lowering Hull leads back down to 2. It was as if everything started to click and the gears began turning for a team which was comprised of what the Americans didn't want. It must have sparked a fire under the team, as evident best by this game against Hull. With nearly 1 minute left in the third period, Larry Rusconi is able to get it past the Hull goaltender, bringing the score to 6-5. The taste of overtime was on their lips. They were so close. It would take one final push for the Pioneers to make it there. With just 15 seconds left in the game, Pioneers forward Taras Tolikovsky made one go past Avril, tying the game just when the fat lady was preparing to sing. A sigh of relief washed over the Plattsburgh faithful, including Pioneers goaltender Joel Kears, who, after giving up those 6 goals, remained flawless to allow the comeback to thrive. It didn't matter to them that after 3 minutes and 46 seconds into overtime, Hull would get past Kears for the first time in nearly 18 minutes, winning the game. Though they claimed they probably could have won the game had Volpita, Hewer, and O'Donnell not been ejected, both players and coaches left the game with a point in their pocket and in good spirits. With this overtime loss, Plattsburgh, though dealing with problems on the defense, was hoping to get some momentum as they traveled up north for the first time into Montreal to play Laval. Back in April of 1984, there was a hockey game between the Quebec Nordiques and the Montreal Canadiens, where a total of 252 penalty minutes were assessed. This game has been sometimes referred to as the Good Friday Massacre, seeing as how many fights, ejections, and injuries were sustained in the melee. This particular game sat as the cherry on top of a scorched and fermented cake known as the Battle of Quebec, baked within a playoff series. Two teams that absolutely hated each other's guts, just duking it out over and over again. It is not a game, but more so an epic, one where gladiators on ice struggle against another to the appeasement of the almighty hockey gods that hold us in contempt. I bring this up because I think it's the perfect illustration of how the idol of hockey is held in this region of the world. Their messiahs of Lemieux, Waugh, and Saint-Louis are held in praise. They smite each other with bolts of lightning, pulsing with rage and animosity, only to be struck back with an equal force. Every action, an opposite, but equal reaction. The Pioneers walked right in the middle of this lion's den like a donkey. But, they were still riding on momentum, so they could possibly put up a fight. They may not win all of the games, but they could make them competitive. Right? There's a saying that states that it can't get any worse. We usually tell ourselves this when we're in a rather poor mood. Maybe we didn't get the part of a show, we were jumped for a promotion by someone else, or maybe you just had a really shit day at school. We all have those days when it can't get any worse. That thinking did not apply to the Pioneers, who were routinely pinballed across the ice by whoever they were playing that game. Things were never easy for them at home, but they proved especially futile on the road, when their average goals against allowed when stepping on an opposing team's ice in September was 6.09. For context, the next worst team in Plattsburgh's division had an average goals against average of 5.39. What didn't help matters at all was the roster size too. In that game against Sejan, Plattsburgh only suited up 14 players for that onslaught, along with one, Ed Constantine, playing with a bruised rib. Typically, a hockey team fields around 20 to 21 players a game, barring injuries or extreme circumstances. Not to Plattsburgh, however, as they ended up having to play in extreme circumstances every night. By the 29th, they were able to get up to 16 players dressed for the game against Chickatumi, but it still wasn't enough. It was lamented before a game against Verdun by Plattsburgh beat writer Bob Getz, who was a primary writer for the Pioneers for the Press Republican, that, along with the lack of wins, things were getting discouraging. It wasn't much of a favor to hear that the biggest drawback on the roster was defense, the very thing that Mathot said was the problem in the first game against Hull. They weren't able to stop the rushes effectively as they should have, usually leaving the goaltender, either Kears or Curry, to scramble to make saves. And remember, this was the 1980s goaltender equipment, which was the equivalent of strapping some pillows and packing peanuts on their hands and legs, shoving them off the ice, and yelling, "Good luck!" There was only so much they could realistically do without shattering both their hands and legs. However, while all of these problems that I just listed are eating the Pioneers away, there's one big thing that is absolutely killing them. The lack of money coming in. In that previously mentioned news article, Gates revealed that only 250 people came to watch the Pioneers. No matter what day it is, who is playing, and what league it is, that is bad. It was just one part of the perpetual cycle that I have dubbed the Plattsburgh pain. It's an incredibly dull and childish way of looking at the situation with the Pioneers. However, I think it at least offers us an easy way to understand the tire spinning that occurred. As I stated previously, my main belief for the Pioneers' failure on and off the ice so far was the lack of an expansion draft that kneecapped the team. Not allowing the team to select from a pool of players from other teams forced them to leave no stone unturned in the search for players to fill the roster. While this wasn't the main catalyst for the Pioneers' troubles, as we'll soon see, we can use this moment as a benchmark for how the snowball began to form. Back to the cycle. As the Pioneers didn't have the most significant players on their team, they naturally lost games. As mentioned, every expansion team does so, but the Pioneers did it at such an extraordinary rate, thus amplifying the next problem, fan apathy. Most of the time, people don't want to travel up to 50 miles in heavy traffic, mazing through a parking lot that will always be a disaster, no matter who's playing or what is going on, and paying the ticket price, which was about $6, a fairly modest ticket cost, but that's besides the point. They go through all of that to watch their team lose by double digits every single game. And remember, this is upstate New York that the Pioneers play in, so the winter snow and frost can make an arduous effort the equivalent of carrying coal to Newcastle. Plus, as Torchetti noted in an interview for Hockey News, people seem to care more for the Plattsburgh Cardinals, the aforementioned NCAA team, that shared the same home with the Pioneers. So what's the incentive to show up to a game if customers could get a far more engaging and exciting product in about the same time frame? This was the question that thousands in Plattsburgh face, and it showed in the lukewarm attendance numbers that cratered after the home opener against Hull. As previously mentioned, that game against Chickatumi netted only 250 fans in attendance. Though it was a game on the weekday, it was still a dire sight. Fewer fans meant that not as many profits were coming into the team. Completely forget the fact that rent was due at $2,000 a month to play in the Ronald B. Stafford Ice Arena. This lack of funds disallowed the team from being able to scout as effectively as they could, preventing the team from expanding their roster to 23. It didn't help that Dennis Mathot was an owner-coach, meaning that the time he could have been spent scouting more effectively was instead sacrificed for the sake of practice and other business matters. This lack of support only plunged the team deeper and deeper into the confines of the hockey world, where only the 1974-75 Capitals drowned. And as the team dropped like an anchor in the Arctic Circle, their grave grew more illustrious in how perplexingly awful it was, which caused more people to abandon the ship, not bothering to watch the team. Thus, we have reached the snake eating its own tail. This loop banishes teams into the confines of legends because of how mismanaged and ugly they were. Modern day examples of this would be like the Arizona Coyotes. However, unlike the Pioneers, the Coyotes have at least the slight ability to improve in a timely manner. They have capital to flush the roster of free agents and trade targets to improve the team in one way or the other. The Pioneers didn't, and they paid dearly for it. For those wondering at home, the QMJHL wasn't exactly helping matters for the Pioneers either. After the game against Verdun, where the Pioneers lost by a score of 13, the league billed the team with a list of demands that were to be shored up by the end of the week. The bulk of the complaints that the league had about Plattsburgh's sinking ship was the fact that Mathot was doing too much in their eyes. As quoted by the commissioner himself, he's doing too much himself. He's a one-man show. You can't run practice and look for players at the same time. In essence, they wanted the team to hire more workers to help them operate more efficiently. Remember, the Pioneers are already having trouble filling their home games up to the 300 mark and are losing money with each passing day. Naturally, Mathot stood his ground against these demands. Though, he complained about the thing that, out of context, was kind of hilarious. In an interview Dennis Mathot conducted with the Hockey News in October of '84, he said that the reason he couldn't hire a secretary to help with the team's operation was that, quote, "It's hard to find a secretary who speaks and reads French." In a nutshell, Mathot was angry about the league being French. Entering October, the archives for the Press Republican go dry. Up to this point, they were the only reliable source of information about the Pioneers and their scores that I could find. How else were we supposed to learn about that one time when Mathot was going to read the riot act to his players after a 13-0 loss to Laval? Or that time Dennis Mathot was thrown out of a game because he wanted to send out his backup goalie to serve a penalty. In any case, I see it as a tragedy. It would provide me with plenty more material to look through and uncover why this team came crashing down in the end. Yet, as the team grew older and more issues were released about them, it's clear that apathy had set in for both the players and the press. The article's length grew to a mere trickle. The prose wasn't as enthusiastic as earlier in the season. There just was little to say about a team like the Pioneers. Bob Gates' banner for the team was flagging in the wind as its hole sucked it down to the depths that only the Pioneers knew. And it wasn't like he had a sudden change of heart about the topic he wrote about either. In November of that year, he would write articles about the Plattsburgh State Cardinals with the same energy that the early articles about the Pioneers had. It was as though fate, witnessing the team getting stuck in the woods, sparked the match with the snap of a finger, forcing them to their own Pompeii. I could go over the games that occurred in October, but is it really worth it? If you desire, here are all the scores that the team had in the month of October. There isn't much to be said that wasn't already explained in the September games. Poor defense leads to the goaltenders having to conquer the ends of the earth just to make it out of the game with less than 10 goals allowed, often failing to do so. Their offense was as much help as a paper bag storing a leaking carton of milk. While the opposition was able to net about 10 goals a game on average, the Pioneers could only muster 3 goals a game. A mere pistol shot in comparison to the cannons that were fired at them. A retaliatory strike that would make Operation Desert Storm wince and how destructive it was. This trend even occurred in the States, as they lost by 11 to Verdun at home. People paid money, knowing full well they never get it back, to watch a team of players who were lost like Bambi in the greater QMJHL scene get Old Yeller by the tune of a 13-0 loss, or 14-3. Things couldn't get much worse, right? Right?
2, 1, 2, 3, 4.
At the end of October, the Pioneers would be moving out of their temporary home, the Ronald B. Stafford Arena, to move to the Crete Civic Center up 5 miles north near Cumberland Bay. The Civic Center was going to be the arena that the Pioneers played in full time from the start of the season, but due to ongoing renovations that pushed those plans back, they had to establish their base in the aforementioned Ronald B. Stafford Arena. This appeared to have drawn new attention to the team, as over 800 people purchased a ticket to watch their game on October 27th. That game never came to pass, however. As the pre-game arrangements were being prepared, the ice compressor, a device that essentially allowed the ice to form in the ice rink, broke down. Maybe foresaw another 15-2 blowout loss to St. John, a team that had tormented the Pioneers more than any other, and figured it wasn't worth it. I would have done the exact same. I'm sure all of you would have as well. On October 29th, 1984, the Plattsburgh Pioneers would travel up to Drummondville and lose 9-3. By all accounts, this would have been an awful game for any other team. Losing by 6 is a rarity these days, and doing so would bring great shame upon a team and fan base. Though the scoring was higher in the 80s, this was still relatively bad. Yet, for the Pioneers, it was a success. Being able to lose only by a single digit was a luxury at that point, as it meant that the goalie did better tonight than others. Never mind the possibility that the Volunteers may have played less aggressively as they could have. Just let the Pioneers have this moment. What I'm going to show you now is one of the few remaining images of the Pioneers that are in full color for us to see. It was during a game against Granby in Plattsburgh. It was their 14-7 loss against them on the 11th of October. They just scored a goal, which, hey, a goal's a goal after all. Yet, look at their demeanor in this photo. Two Pioneers players are just going in for head pats, but they don't seem enthusiastic about it. The one on the left is looking somewhere else. Might as well have been looking towards the stands, just waiting to get out of there. This leaves just one player we can recognize, John O'Donnell. By the end of October, he will have finished the month with just 4 points, none of which were goals. It was like he wasn't there at all. His contribution, his sacrifices, his time wasn't needed here. It didn't need to be in upstate New York losing by 10 every game for the sake of the Q. I think he might have known this just by this picture. It says more about the team than any word ever could. It was yet another game where the Pioneers lost. It would be the last time that the Pioneers lost. In fact, it was their last game ever. On the night of October 29th, 1984, Dennis Bethought ended the American experiment by disbanding the Pioneers. Players and coaches soon spread out looking for new teams and positions. O'Donnell ended up with Hull, the team that they nearly beat on opening night for a single game before pinballing around lower leagues, eventually being out of hockey in 1990. Some weren't even as lucky as that. Dennis Bethought had apparently run a debt of over $200,000 after his main source of cash was frozen by Plattsburgh banks over a failure to pay for the time the Pioneers played in the Civic Center, which was roughly $153,000 in today's money. The president of the QMJHL claimed that this is what killed the Pioneers in his eyes. The Board of Governors were also actively hostile to the idea of keeping the Pioneers around under the helm of Bethought. In their eyes, he was the one that led the team off a cliff like a donkey being moved with a carrot on a stick. What reason did they have to keep the Pioneers under him? In fact, what reason did the league have to keep the Pioneers in any case? This was a team born out of the clutches of an entity that mismanaged its birth upon this soil, allowing it to fester in agony, writhing out brutal loss after brutal loss. The team pioneered new ways to lose hockey games. This was what the team always was. This is what the team was going to be. Had they not closed up shop in late October, I doubt they would have rebounded. All of the problems that plagued the team left it as a serf at the whims of the other teams in the league. The Board of Governors probably saw this littered field of broken bodies and dreams that stretched over the New England area, and turned to one another, internally asking themselves the same question: what's the point? It was decided that all stats about the Pioneers and their players would be scratched off the record book. Final records for every team that played against Plattsburgh would be altered by 1 or 2 games, leaving them with only 68 total games played. The only reason that stats revolving around the Pioneers and their players are still available to us is because of the archives and newspapers from when the team played, such as the Hockey News and the Press Republican. Had it not been for the efforts of Gates and others around the time, we would have potentially had no idea what happened in each game. It wasn't like the league offered the Pioneers a glorious send-off either. In archives about the season that the league bothered to write about the Pioneers in, they described the team as simply weren't talented enough to compete at a major junior level. A shallow grave for a team that they treated like an irresponsible 8-year-old treating a pet goldfish. Pioneers to them were nothing but a blemish on the league that acted more as a mercy killing with its contraction rather than a legitimate team. The venture stunted any progress that the QMJHL might have taken stateside for decades. Had the Pioneers been able to get a stable foothold in those first 2 months of operation, perhaps even making it through a whole year with decent attendance, the league might have looked into further expansion within the Northeast, with cities such as Burlington, Vermont, and Bangor, Maine, further cementing their foothold in New England. Yet, because the Pioneers were historically awful, driving away any interest in the team or the league in the Plattsburgh area, they got cold feet and stayed within the confines of Canada. The Pioneers potentially ruined the league's plans for expansion that would have helped develop a strong United States presence, enough to compete with the WHL and the OHL at the time. In an ironic twist of fate, the measures that led to the Pioneers fielding a poorer team full of Americans were all for naught. In 1995, over a decade after the team passed into the realm of the Cleveland Barons in the original USFL, the referendum for Quebec independence was voted on. This referendum was more heated than the one in 1980, as 15 years of built-up political moves, growing frustrations over the Canadian Constitution, and Quebec nationalism all came together into a melting pot for this very moment. The vote was a hair close, as a vote for yes, which would allow Quebec to enter the world stage as a free nation, lost out by 1.16% of the vote. The result of this referendum buckled the Parti Québécois platform. Though future candidates promised another referendum in 1998, it would never come to pass. To this day, Quebec has remained a part of Canada and will appear to be so in the near future. The tale of the Pioneers and the QMJHL at the time is that of pride. A tale of a league that was steadfast in its Quebec roots, taking pride in its French-Canadian prospects, that it allowed the Pioneers to crater into the ground for the sake of its heritage, with the belief that Americans would migrate to the league for having a team in the US. It's a story of a province that attempted to exercise the most extreme measures for an entity in a country to commit for the sake of its nationalistic pride, undoing years of collaborative work with the Canadian government for a referendum that fell just short. Some could argue that's the story of an American team attempting to shoehorn itself into a French-Canadian league with no regard to the customs or culture that it has, exemplified by the struggles owner Dennis Methot had with the French influence of the league. The fact that Methot complained about the majority of league notices coming in French might have swayed sympathy away from him. Yet, in all of these conflicting scenarios where pride blindfolded the individuals around them, I find it hard to believe that Methot was a prideful man. From all accounts of the man, from players, coaches, to reports, he was a man that everyone seemed to like, let alone feel pity for. John Torchetti, in that same interview for the Hockey News, commented, "He did everything he could to make it work. He was such a nice person. This whole thing just drained him." People who claimed that the Pioneers were a walking clown show that ruined the sanctity of the league soon found themselves pitying the ruined owner. While some still deride him for his efforts, I just find it a difficult task to complete. Was he in over his head? Probably. But would I say that he had malicious intentions in his doings? Absolutely not. Dennis Mathot would return to the University of Troy-Riviere after the venture and continue his life in silence. He had no comments about his time in Plattsburgh for the 2019 Hockey News interview. However, the story of the QMJHL in the United States doesn't end here. During the 1990s, a wave of relocations took place surrounding the teams in the American Hockey League, the NHL's feeder league, with teams being purged from Atlantic Canada. This saw teams like the Halifax Citadels packing their bags in 1993, eventually ending up as the Wilkes-Barre Scranton Penguins, the Cape Breton Oilers hauling operations to become the Hamilton Bulldogs, eventually landing on the other side of the continent to become the Bakersfield Condors, and St. John losing its team in the Flames to financial instability, eventually re-emerging as the Stockton Heat after a litany of moves. Smelling blood in the water, the QMJHL decided it would step outside of Quebec for the first time since its disastrous venture with the Pioneers, establishing teams in all of the cities mentioned previously. However, in sheer contrast to the demise of the Pioneers, these teams were able to flourish under proper ownership and deals that didn't sandbag them into the jaws of the basement. Teams like the Halifax Moose, St. John Sea Dogs, and Cape Breton Eagles are staples of the league, dominating the Atlantic Canada region in terms of teams present. With this newfound success, the league was revitalized, flushing the ranks with fresh talent that allowed them to compete with the likes of the best OHL and WHL teams. More importantly to this story, it allowed the league to re-embrace the idea of an American team joining. In 2003, the Sherbrooke Castors were looking for a new home to play in after falling on hard times. The team could have moved anywhere in Quebec or Atlantic Canada if they so wished. Laval had a vacancy that wouldn't be filled until 2017, when the AHL came to town. Granby hadn't had a team since the late 90s. Hell, they could have even attempted to venture into Labrador if they truly wanted to gamble. Yet, the team owner Mark Just had a different gamble in mind, and set his eyes on a land that hadn't been tapped since the 80s. Some may have called the move a fool's errand, considering how the last foray into the States went for the league. Some might have found it odd how the league would dip its toes into the States since it was primarily a French-Canadian league. Some might have just found the new name of the team to be stupid. In whatever case, the Lewiston Maniacs were born. And though they only lasted 8 years in the league before they were bought and disbanded in 2011, they accomplished so much more than the Pioneers did. Maybe it was the spirit of the Pioneers that lingered within New England that allowed the Maniacs to prosper where they failed. Realistically, it was the good team that came over from Sherbrooke and good moves that allowed the team to succeed. But that's no fun. And after all that the Pioneers went through in those few months, I think they deserve this little bit of credit.